What an honor it is to be here with Jeremy Scahill and Noam Chomsky. And I wanted to start with Noam responding to Jeremy's investigations and the description, putting in the context of the history of U.S. foreign policy.
Well, I happened to get an email this morning from a person who many of you know, Fred Brantman. He's a counterpart of Jeremy from back in the 60s. He's the person who worked for years with enormous courage and effort to try to expose what were called the secret wars. The secret wars were perfectly public wars, which the media were keeping secret. Government and Fred, this is in Laos, he finally did succeed in breaking through, and tremendous exposure of huge wars that were going on. A war in northern Laos attacking a peasant society that was so remote from what was happening in the Indochina wars that many of them probably didn't even know they were in Laos. Actually, with Fred, I met many of them in refugee camps after a CIA mercenary army drove them out from areas where they'd been hiding in caves for 2 years under intense bombardment. He then proceeded to help expose the even worse wars in Cambodia and then the air wars in general. Anyway, background. One thing he's a great admirer of Jeremy's, I should say, for very good reasons, which you just heard, and I hope we'll read and see. But Fred made an interesting point. He reminded me of a comment by a high American official back in 1968, who Fred was trying to get to speak. It's not easy to get these people to speak, but he did. And this official, he was asking him, why is this intensive bombing going on of northern Laos? Nothing to do with the war in Indochina, just destruction of a poor peasant society. One of the most malevolent acts of modern history, I think. And the official finally explained. He said, look, there's a temporary bombing of cessation of the bombing of North Vietnam. And we have all these planes, and we don't have anything to do with them. So we'll bomb Laos. Okay, I think that's the lesson of history that we should bear in mind in reading Jeremy's exposures of first Blackwater and the mercenary army and now JSOC, the so-called secret army. Secret the same way the secret wars were secret. If you have a reporter who's willing to has the courage and integrity to expose it, you can expose it. These resources are there. They're growing. They have a self-generating capacity. They're going to get larger and larger. They're going to want more and more to do. And if one target disappears, they'll be turned somewhere else. And as Jeremy hinted, they'll be turned here. And there's a history of that, too. If some of you want to read about it, there's a very important book by a historian, very good historian, Al McCoy, who, among other things, studied the history of drugs and torture and so on. But he's a Philippine historian, mainly. And he did a study of the Philippine War, the U.S. counterinsurgency war in the Philippines over a century ago. It was a brutal, murderous war, hundreds of thousands of people slaughtered, horror story. And he pointed out that at the time, after the war was over, when the so-called pacification began, the U.S. Forces, were the Marines mostly in those days, were using the highest technology available to develop a surveillance system over the Philippine society, so they could do what by our standards now, at a primitive level, the kinds of things that Jeremy described. And they did. and it's turned the Philippines into the Philippines 100 years later have never escaped from this. Philippine society is permeated by the consequences of this long terror war. But McCoy pointed out something else. He pointed out that these measures from before the First World War were very quickly picked up domestically, both by the British and the United States, and applied to surveillance and control techniques within their own societies, FBI here and so on. That's what we can expect, and signs of it are already around. The resources are there. They're self-generating. They're going to grow. They're going to develop. If the current targets disappear, they'll move on to new targets, because that's the nature of these systems, just like the planes who had nowhere to bomb, so they decided to send them to bomb northern Laos, and they'll come home. Already happening, and we can expect more and more of it. I think that's the historical background that should very much be kept in mind.
One thing that's important to keep in mind is that very little of what this administration or the Bush administration did was actually new ideas. They were old, existing ideas and resurrections of certain plans and programs. I mean, if you look at the Phoenix program in Vietnam, which was this assassination program that was being run in Vietnam, there are very serious parallels to what the United States was doing in Iraq. You know, the dominant historical narrative is that the surge won the Iraq War, and General, Petraeus, had he not gone down for, the only thing that seems to be capable of taking down the powerful is these sort of, what they do in their top secret chambers. They can wage all the so-called secret wars they want, but if they do something in their own secret life, then then you can bring them down. But Petraeus is often celebrated as this sort of hero who won the Iraq War because of the surge. But in reality, you had this merciless killing campaign that was being run by General Stanley McChrystal and Admiral William McRaven, where they were just bumping off the leadership of any cell that would pop up, but also just killing a tremendous number of people in general. And so you had military figures that grew up in a certain era with an understanding of these programs. And when Cheney and Rumsfeld came into power with Bush, they really saw, even before 9/11 happened, saw the historical moment that they had in front of them to sort of redraw maps and implement a vision of the world where Iran-Contra was a noble act. And sort of the model for how the U.S. should be conducting its foreign policy. I don't know if many of you know this, but Cheney was in Congress at the time that Iran-Contra was being investigated, and he authored the minority report in the House defending Iran-Contra and viewed it as a sort of heroic, necessary action. And they had this view of the unitary executive, the idea that when it comes to these national security issues, that the White House is essentially a dictatorship, and that Congress's only function is to fund the operations but not be involved with overseeing them or having any meaningful oversight of these operations. And President Obama really had an opportunity to roll back some of the executive branch power grabs that Bush and Cheney had engaged in, and instead he sort of doubled down on them and has been waging an unprecedented war against whistleblowers and using the Espionage Act, and reserving the right of the state to keep secret from the American people evidence that would indicate why someone was being assassinated, to keep secret, to use the state secrets privilege in repeated lawsuits brought against former officials or torturers, having cases thrown out of court, using the full power structure of the executive branch in the same excessive way that was being used under Bush and Cheney.
We're talking about U.S. officials. Can you talk about McRaven and Gardez?
That's a lot. Yeah, so one of the stories in the book, and also you'll see this in our film. One of the characters in our film is Admiral William McRaven, who is, I think, one of the most powerful military figures in modern U.S. history. McRaven is the current commander of SOCOM, the Special Operations Command, in charge of all special operations activity across the globe in more than 100 countries. But McRaven was actually an original member of SEAL Team 6, the Naval Warfare Development Group, DevGru it's called now. He was an original member of SEAL Team 6 and spent much of his career in the shadows of covert and clandestine U.S. military operations. And he would have been forward deployed to Afghanistan shortly after 9/11, but he had injured his back in a parachuting accident at a training exercise in California, where there was where his SEAL team was based at the time. And so instead of forward deploying to Afghanistan, Admiral McRaven was tapped by General Wayne Downing, who was coming up with the process for putting people on these kill lists after 9/11 and trying to take down all of the leadership of al-Qaeda or anyone that they could attach to the 9/11 attacks. And Downing asked Admiral McRaven to come and advise the National Security Council. People think of the National Security Council as this huge body. It's the President, the Vice President, the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of State, and then staffers, but it really is just the core officials who dictate this policy. So if the NSC is making decisions about targeted killing, it's really the principals that are doing with national defense, national security, counterterrorism. So McRaven became the advisor to the most powerful officials in the U.S. government in developing how to implement the hunting down and killing of Osama bin Laden and others. And at the beginning, there were, by some estimates, between 7 and 24 individuals that were put on this list for, in the beginning it was kill or capture, but the emphasis was often on kill. And McRaven saw firsthand how the White House worked, and he learned a great deal about the politics of an administration because he was there helping to craft a policy that he would later then run when he became the head of all Special Operations Forces. So McRaven is there for a couple of years and then ends up going to Iraq, where he was the deputy commander of the Joint Special Operations Command under Stanley McChrystal, who was very close to Dick Cheney. Cheney had gotten him a fellowship at the Council on Foreign Relations. And McChrystal was the commander of JSOC for much of the Bush administration. McRaven is working under McChrystal, running the kill campaign in Iraq and coordinating all of these actions against both what was called al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia or al-Qaeda in Iraq, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, and also going after Muqtada al-Sadr's forces and others. So he sort of understood both ends of the game, how it was run in the White House and then how it was implemented in the field. And when President Obama came into office, the two people who were responsible for the most covert, sensitive operations being run by primarily Cheney and Rumsfeld outside of the chain of command were General McChrystal and Admiral McRaven, and they became the two most influential figures in shaping the Obama administration's counterterrorism policy. And so President Obama really empowered those forces and actually had McRaven in the White House helping to shape the policy, not just implement the military actions, but actually shaping policy. And most people had never heard of Admiral McRaven, and of course he's now a kind of iconic figure because he commanded the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. And of course Disney tried to trademark SEAL Team 6 after the bin Laden raid. It's a true story. But the way that I discovered the identity of Admiral McRaven was in February of 2010, there was a raid in Gardez in Afghanistan in Paktia province, and a U.S. Special Operations team had intelligence that there was a Taliban compound and that people living in a particular compound in this area were members of the Taliban and were plotting attacks against American forces. And they raid this compound in the middle of the night, and they end up killing a number of men and 2 pregnant women. And it turned out that this was not a Taliban family. In fact, they weren't even ethnic Pashtun. They were from a minority ethnic group in the province, and the man of the house was a senior Afghan police commander who had been trained by the U.S. forces. And his family showed me his documents. He had actually been trained by a private security company called MPRI, which is made up of high-ranking former military officials, intelligence officials, and others. And so these women were killed. This Afghan police commander who had fought with U.S. soldiers against the Taliban and against the Haqqani network in his province, and whose house was filled with pictures of him and U.S. soldiers smiling in these pictures, had just been killed. And when the commandos the U.S. commandos that raided the house realized that they had killed these women and that the men that they had killed were not in fact Taliban, and that what they were doing that night was the most anti-Taliban of things they could have been doing, which was to be having a party with live music celebrating the naming of a child, and men were dancing and playing instruments, and it was this loud, boisterous party, and we have their cell phone video from that night. So they raid this house, these people are killed. Instead of saying, wow, we really messed up, and owning it, and that stuff happens every day in Afghanistan. People are getting killed all the time that have no attachment whatsoever to the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or the Haqqani network, and the U.S. will often just pay them a little bit of money and move on, and it never makes it into the papers. That wouldn't have been out of place, but instead of doing that, they dug the bullets out of the women's bodies, and then they told their commanders that what had happened in the compound that night was a Taliban ambush of this family, and that they had come upon these women who had been killed by the Taliban. And then there were leaks saying that, well, no, this was actually an honor killing, and the women were killed by their own family members. And they put out a press release, and spokespeople made these statements saying that the U.S. soldiers were essentially heroes that had gone in there and saved everyone else. But then the family members, because they were a prominent family, one of the fathers of the women was the vice dean at Gardez University, who spoke fluent English, started calling reporters and telling people, you know, this is not what NATO is saying. Then a very great reporter named Jerome Starkey actually went down there. He writes for the Times of London and interviewed the family members and did a story saying that this was a NATO raid. He didn't know it was JSOC at the time, that this was a botched NATO raid and that NATO had tried to cover it up. And he told the story of these families. And when Jerome Starkey did this, NATO did something extraordinary. They named him in a press release and said Jerome Starkey of the Times of London is lying. They actually accused him of lying. And I mean, that could have ended Starkey's career. And Starkey, to his credit, kept pushing and pushing and ended up doing a number of stories and got close to that family. And Rick and I also went to this family and filmed with them. And you see this in our video, and tell this story and tell the story of what happened to Jerome Starkey as well. So media attention is focused in now on this village and this one family's compound. And eventually, NATO calls up Starkey and they said, we're about to put out a press release, we're going to change our version of events. And they admit that their forces had killed, that NATO forces had killed these pregnant women and that the men were not Taliban commanders. So the family told me and told Jerome Starkey the same thing, which is that they got a call and a person they believed was General Stanley McChrystal was going to be coming to visit them. And at the time, McChrystal was the commander of all U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan. And they actually were plotting, they wanted to kill General McChrystal. They wanted to stab him to death when he came into their home. And one of the men told me that when they did this to my family, I wanted to put on a suicide vest and blow myself up among the Americans. Remember, these were U.S. allies. And now they're saying, I want a suicide vest and I want to kill General McChrystal, who was the leader of the war. And an imam at their local mosque said, no, you're not to do that. You're to give him hospitality like our people do, and you're welcome him into your home and hear what he has to say. So they thought that General McChrystal was coming to see them. They called Jerome Starkey. Starkey goes down there with his photographer, Jeremy Kelly, and they're waiting with the family, thinking that McChrystal's going to show up. And up pulls this convoy of vehicles with countless Afghan military officials and some Americans interspersed with them. And in the center of this crowd is a guy with a name tag that says McRaven on it and has 3 stars on the lapel. And they've brought with them 2 sheep. And they approached the compound in the very place where the women had been killed and this police commander had been killed. And they offload these sheep and they put a knife up to the sheep's neck and they're going to sacrifice the sheep. And what they were doing was a ritual from these people's culture, the people who were the victims of this, and it was like a forgiveness ritual. So they're coming, Admiral McRaven shows up with some sheep after this family had been gunned down, and then they had blamed it on the family and then said it was Taliban, and this scene is unfolding. This photographer, Jeremy Kelly, starts taking pictures of, he didn't know who he was at the time, of Admiral McRaven. And at the time, Admiral McRaven was the commander of the most elite, secretive U.S. military force. and he shows up with a sheep in Gardez, Afghanistan, and they're offering to sacrifice it. And the American and Afghan forces try to stop the photographer. They try to hit the camera away. They say that Starkey and Jeremy Kelly are not allowed in. But the family, and it was so smart of them, the family said, no, we want him here as a witness so that someone independent is here to know what goes on today. And so they have photos, and Starkey took in shorthand all the notes of what McRaven said in the room that day. And McRaven admitted to the head of this household that it was his forces that had killed these pregnant women, and the Afghan police commander, and he apologized. And then there were all these stories that went out on ABC News and others that the head of the household had accepted the apology. When I spoke to him, he said, I don't accept their apology at all. He said, the special forces did cruel things to us. They beat us, they ruined our life, they wiped out our economy in our compound by taking away all of these people, and they killed our pregnant women. I wouldn't trade my 2 sons for the entire kingdom of the United States, is what he said. And another man chimed in and he said, these are these commandos with beards. We call them the American Taliban. And this is an anti-Taliban family. And so, you know, when I watched the bin Laden raid coverage and people started saying JSOC publicly, and we were showed, you know, that the dog was named Cairo and was a Belgian Malinois or whatever, and then we know what guns were used, and, you know, Rick and I talk about this all the time. We know every detail that was leaked, and of course a lot of it turned out to be not true, but that's for a different story. I was thinking, where was the coverage of, like, wall-to-wall coverage of this operation that they did? Because that would give us a little bit more of a balanced picture of what happens in the thousands of night raids that happen every year in Afghanistan or in Pakistan or in countries that we're not even aware we're raiding right now. And so that story for me really resonated strongly because I think we only have a tiny fraction of understanding the extent of the kinds of operations that are being done on a daily basis around the world. And we often hear about them when they go the way that those in power want, or when the version that they want publicized is the one accepted by powerful media outlets.
Noam, if you could respond to what Jeremy said, and also you have written extensively about the killing of Osama bin Laden, and I was wondering if you could comment on that.
That I've written plenty of unpopular articles, and one of the most unpopular had to do with the murder, not killing, of Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden was a suspect. There are principles, believe it or not, that are not only in the Constitution, but that go back to 800 years, to Magna Carta, the foundations of Anglo-American law. That's, they put it in narrow terms, but the general principle, including Jeremy's quite correct expansion of it to people other than our own citizens, is that a person can't be punished by the state without due process of law and a speedy trial by his peers. Well, it's a reasonable principle. It's in the Constitution. It was narrow, if you look. So in the Constitution, it naturally didn't apply to Native Americans. It didn't apply to blacks. It dubiously applied to women, who at the time were considered property, not people. But over the years, it's been expanded, and unless it gets to the point where that Jeremy was talking about, where it's just human beings, we can't call ourselves a civilized society. Anyway, those are the principles. Osama bin Laden was a suspect. In fact, personally, I don't have any doubt that he was responsible, but my personal opinion is nothing that stands up in a court of law. You have to have evidence, you have to have a trial, a serious trial, and it was pretty clear that the U.S. government didn't want that. He was captured, apprehended by, you know, the most skilled masters of war, to use the Somali warlord's expression, that exist in the world, 80 of them, I think. He was defenseless. The first story that came out was that they had to shoot him because his wife lunged at the SEALs. And what could they do? You know, they had to kill everybody. But that story was later withdrawn. There was nothing. He was just apprehended, defenseless, murdered, body thrown into the ocean, leaving obvious questions as to why. The dangers of this operation, a lot of the aspects of this operation, so it was a criminal, in my view, just a complete criminal act, no justification. But there's more to it than this. And I was kind of reminded of it when Jeremy talked about the Yemeni testimony at the Senate. Those of you might have looked at the little tiny report on that hidden in the New York Times. He said something else, this man who testified. He said that for years, the Al-Qaeda, the Islamist radicals, Al-Qaeda they call them, had been trying to turn the people of this village against the Americans. And they didn't succeed, but you've succeeded with one drone strike. You're creating more people to kill you, as you pointed out. And the same is true of the Osama bin Laden assassination. First of all, the action itself was extremely hazardous. The Navy SEALs who were sent in were under orders to shoot their way out if they got into any trouble. Well, if they'd started, the Pakistani army is a professional army, very committed to the defense of the country, the sovereignty of the country. If they had been caught there and tried to shoot their way out, they wouldn't have been left alone. The American forces next door would have come in massive force, and we might have been involved in a nuclear war. I mean, it was quite possible. That was part of the threat. But there was something else that happened. Actually, it's been reported recently, I think, in Scientific American, but it was known. I mean, the way that they identified bin Laden was through a fraudulent vaccination campaign. They had doctors posing to do anti-polio vaccination in a poor area of this town. Well, they pretty soon figured out it's not the poor area, it's the rich area, so they stopped the program in the middle, which is criminal in itself. Actually, running the program was criminal. Using a vaccination program and doctors to try to apprehend a suspect. I mean, that violates principles going back to the Hippocratic Oath. But then they stopped it in the middle because they thought they were in the wrong area, more crimes. Then they finally identified him. But one consequence of their actions was there is always in these societies serious concern about what outsiders, Americans, are up to when they come in and start sticking needles in people and so on. That's always there. It takes a lot of work to overcome that hostility. And it was being overcome in Pakistan. Now it's gone. They will not permit people to come in carrying out vaccinations. Polio is almost gone in the world. Pakistan's one of the last places where it survives. Okay, we're encouraging the spread of polio. And as one commentator pointed out, back to the Yemeni in the Senate, one of these days people are going to look at this crippled child and say, you did it to us. And you can guess what's going to happen then.
If you missed that testimony in the Senate, in the first ever Senate drone hearings of this young Yemeni activist and freelance journalist, you can go to democracynow.org because last Wednesday we played it in full. And you can watch him and also read the transcript. But Noam, I wanted to ask you to follow up on Jeremy's opening point around the killing and closing point, the killing of Americans versus people anywhere.
Well, Jeremy's point is exactly right. And the murder of Awlaki, and we should be honest about it, was, you take a look at the New York Times the next day. There was a headline which said something like, West celebrates death of radical cleric. Good, we murdered him. radical cleric. Then concerns began to mount over the fact that he was an American. You know, a bit of a problem, should be going around killing Americans. And that's pretty scandalous. I'll just reiterate what Jeremy said. It doesn't matter whether they're Americans or whatever they are, they're people. Going back to Magna Carta, the concept of people free of these, should be free of state terror, has been expanded over the years, substantially. And it should be expanded to include people. They should be free of state terror. I should say that myself, I'm kind of hesitant about some of the things I do myself. Right now, I'm a plaintiff in a suit against the NDAA. The NDAA proposals, Obama's latest National Defense Authorization Act, includes provisions which make it optional for the government, if it chooses, to place American citizens under indefinite detention in military prisons, which is an incredible crime. You know, again, back to Magna Carta, much worse. And if Chris Hedges organized a suit to try to oppose this, and I signed on, but with reservations, because what difference does it make if they're American citizens? I mean, the same NDAA Act authorized, in fact, makes it mandatory in some circumstances for the government to place non-American citizens under indefinite preventive detention. That's what we should be concerned with. This suit, incidentally, has taken an interesting course. Obama originally had said that he was opposed to those provisions in the act, but he would sign them. Then when the case went to court, at the lower court level, the government case, the plaintiffs won. The judge threw out the government prosecution because the prosecution refused to answer a simple question: will these plaintiffs be subject to administrative detention? Could they be? And they refused to answer that, so the judge threw that out. Obama immediately took it to the higher court. That shows you how much opposed he is to it. It'll work its way to the Supreme Court, and given the Supreme Court, the government will probably win. Well, you know, these are things we should really be concerned about. It's not, if you want to know what, I'm sure you all know, but if you really want to know in detail what happens to non-citizens, read some of the testimonies. So, for example, there's a recent book that came out by an Australian, David Hill, I think his name is, very much worth reading. He's a young man who was hiking around somewhere in northern Afghanistan. He was picked.
David Hicks.
David Hicks, yeah. He was picked up by the Northern Alliance, the U.S. allies. They sold him for bounty to the American forces. And then he describes his years in Bagram and then in Guantanamo, I think it was about 6 or 7 years. The torture, the sadism, the cruelty are just indescribable. These are American soldiers, you know, elite American soldiers. You just really have to read that too. I mean, if anybody knows American history, it won't surprise you that much, but it's right in front of our eyes. And he said something quite interesting in his testimony, which I was struck by. He says the soldiers, of course, these guys were shackled, bound, you know, couldn't move, surrounded by all kinds of military police and so on. But he said the guards were afraid of the prisoners. He said the guards had been so brainwashed by whatever training they went through that they thought these prisoners were superhuman. He said guards would come to his cell sometimes where he's shackled and, you know, and so on, and ask him to perform some of his feats, like, you know, climb on the ceiling, show us how you do it, and this kind of thing. And in fact, when they took them out to be interrogated, they'd have like a platoon of Marines around them to make sure that they didn't carry out some incredibly monstrous act that these soldiers had probably seen in a video movie somewhere. But he said they really were terrified of the prisoners. And that tells us something else about our own society. That what are we doing to our own society when we're creating such a terror and fear among ordinary people? I mean, it's kind of like having guns in school, you know, armed policemen in schools. Is that what you want your children to see? That we live in a society where you have to have people with guns around to protect you from some unimaginable danger. And here there's another serious, as far as American culture is concerned, something very much to be concerned about. This is a very frightened society. Always has been. Goes back to colonial times. It's very striking. Today it is taking a remarkable form. If you look at the gun culture, the people who are pressing for having guns are terrified. A lot of them are simply terrified. They're like these guards standing outside the prison. What are they terrified of? You've got to have guns to protect themselves from who? The federal government, the United Nations, aliens, whoever it may be. We don't know what horrible force is coming after us, but we have to have guns to protect ourselves. I mean, put aside the fact that guns wouldn't do you any good and they'll probably kill each other, but the fear throughout the society is simply incredible.
Jeremy.
Just a couple of things in response there. I was remembering when you were talking about David Hicks' story, this case that I came across in Yemen of a journalist named Abdullah Haider Shaya. When President Obama first authorized the bombing of Yemen was in December of 2009. The first strike that we know of authorized under the Obama administration was on December 17th, 2009 in Yemen. There hadn't been a U.S. bombing there that we know of since November of 2002. The first drone strike, actually, that was conducted outside of Afghanistan was in Yemen in 2002, and it killed a number of people, including a U.S. citizen named Kamal Darwish. And he actually was not supposedly the target of that strike, but they claim that he had ties to a terror cell called the Lackawanna 6, which, like many of the plots we've seen lately, seem to have been, in large part, the FBI breaking up its own plot, and which is really scandalous if you look at how many times this has happened and all these cases of entrapment. So President Obama decides to start bombing Yemen in December of 2009. They do this strike on what they are told by the Yemeni government and by U.S. intelligence is an al-Qaeda training camp, and that there is this notorious al-Qaeda figure who's known to be in the camp. Well, it turned out that this guy, when we investigated it and went to Yemen and spoke to people that knew him and knew the infrastructure of AQAP, that he was an old jihadist who had fought in the Mujahideen war in Afghanistan and had a very peripheral connection to al-Qaeda. So it seems like what happened is that the U.S. outsources a lot of its intelligence gathering in Yemen to notoriously corrupt Yemeni officials and agencies and to the Saudis. And the Saudis have their own war that they're waging inside of Yemen. The U.S.-backed dictatorship of Ali Abdullah Saleh was playing multiple sides, playing the Saudis, playing the U.S., playing various tribes inside the country. There were several occasions when Saleh fed the U.S. intelligence saying someone was al-Qaeda, and it turned out to be a political opponent of the regime that was being killed or assassinated by the U.S. on behalf in the service of the dictator of Yemen. And so in this case, in December 17, 2009, they bombed this village supposedly to kill this one guy who does not seem to have been anything even vaguely resembling a senior al-Qaeda figure in the country. And after the missile strike happens, the Yemeni government puts out a press release taking credit for the strike, saying it had conducted these airstrikes, and the Obama administration congratulated the Yemeni government on taking the fight to the terrorists in Yemen. A number of tribal leaders in Yemen got phone calls from this small, poor Bedouin village called Al-Majala, that this missiles had slammed into the area and had shredded people into meat. And these tribal leaders went there, and also this young journalist, Abdullah Haider Shaya, who had done reporting and work for the Washington Post, for ABC News, for Al Jazeera. He was a very, very well-known journalist in Yemen, and he was known because he was a brave guy who would go and actually interview al-Qaeda figures. Much of what the United States knows about certain leaders in al-Qaeda comes from the reporting of Abdullah Haider Shaya. You could look at it one way and say he was a very valuable guy to have out talking to these people, because it helped the U.S. intelligence officials understand, or operatives understand, who it was they were supposedly trying to kill. But that's for a different story. So this guy goes there, these tribal leaders go there, and they take photographs of the missile parts. And they then show them, broadcast them on Al Jazeera and other outlets, and share them with Amnesty International. And Amnesty International has a weapons expert come in and analyze them, and they determined that they were it was a cruise missile attack. And when Rick and I were in Abyan province, we had the parts filmed. They're still there in the desert, by the way. You can go, if you want to try to go to El Majul, you can go there, and they're still in the middle of the desert. With General Dynamics and Made in the USA right there visible, and we show this in our film. We show the aftermath of this bombing and the missile parts that were still there, well after the bombs had dropped. But the U.S. also, but the other bombs that they found there were cluster bombs, which of course are banned under international conventions. And the cluster bombs are basically, I saw the effect of them when the U.S. was using them in the Kosovo War in 1999. I went to the Niš marketplace after it was bombed in Serbia and saw the aftermath of it. They're like flying landmines, and they shred everything in its path into meat and limbs, and it is horrifying to see the aftermath of any bombing, but cluster bombs are a particularly brutal weapon. And there were unexploded cluster bombs that were left there, and after the bombing had taken place, some children were playing near a cluster bomb and picked one of them up, and it blew them to pieces 2 days after the bombing had happened. So they take these pictures, they send them to Amnesty International, and these sheikhs, tribal sheikhs, organized a gathering to say that this is not the Yemeni government that did this because Yemen doesn't have these missiles. Amnesty does an analysis of them and determines that they were in fact U.S. weapons, and that only the United States could have been responsible for that bombing. And so this sort of scandal was brewing inside of Yemen because the people who were killed there were at least 46 people killed. 14 of the people killed were women, and 21 were children. When the Yemeni parliament, which is supported by the United States, went to investigate it, they listed all of the dead, their ages, their names, their genders, and I got a copy of that report and have the list of every single person that we know of that was killed in that strike. And we added it up, and it was 14 women and 21 children among the 46 dead. And in the pursuit of trying to kill this one person who the President of the United States had been told was this high-value target, who everyone in Yemen says was an older mujahideen who had primarily done his jihad in Afghanistan and not inside of Yemen. When this started to become public, this Yemeni journalist was going on Al Jazeera and was helping other U.S. media outlets report that story, that it was in fact a U.S. strike. U.S. officials were denying it, and eventually then anonymously said, yes, we were behind the strike, but General David Petraeus said that no civilians were actually killed in the strike and that it's all a big exaggeration, which was very offensive to Yemenis of all political stripes, and so it was an enduring scandal. And this one journalist was really pushing this story. And he continued to report on the expanding U.S. air war in Yemen. And one night, in the middle of the night, he was out with a friend of his who was a political cartoonist, and they were shopping, and he was snatched by U.S.-backed, U.S.-trained counterterrorism forces in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, and was taken to the political security prison and was beaten bloody by the security services and told that he was to stop talking about the missile strikes. And then they released him onto the streets. And what this journalist did was to go straight to Al Jazeera and say, I was just beaten by the political security officers, and they're trying to stop me from talking about the U.S. missile strikes that are happening in the country. And soon after he did that, his house was raided by the CTU, the Counterterrorism Unit, which is a JSOC and CIA-trained entity, and they snatched him out of his home and disappeared him for 30 days. And no one knew where he was. And then they hauled him into a court that had been specifically set up by the dictatorship to prosecute journalists for crimes against the state, and was ultimately convicted of being an al-Qaeda facilitator, because he facilitated al-Qaeda members being able to speak to the media. And which I've talked to people in U.S. intelligence who actually also believe that this case is outrageous, because they said you took off the streets one of the best reporters that we would read, so we could actually understand what was going on in Yemen, because of the notorious corruption of all of the informants. So he is put into this prison. He's put on trial, total sham trial. His lawyers refused to present a defense. No lawyer would represent him at his own request, because he said, I don't want to recognize a shred of legitimacy of this process. And we have video of him when he is in prison. They bring him in front of into the courtroom in a cell. They have him in a cage in the cell. And as they're pulling him away, he said, my crime is exposing the American missile attack on the tiny Bedouin village of Al-Majala in Abyan province. They're putting me in jail because I exposed their cruise missile attack. And he said, this is what happens when Yemeni journalists are real journalists, and they pull him away, and they disappear him into this prison. There was so much outrage in Yemen from his tribe and from human rights organizations and from mainstream civil society in Yemen that the dictator, Ali Abdullah Saleh, had no choice but to issue a pardon against Abdullah Haider Shaya. This happens a lot in Yemen. Someone gets arrested, the tribes protest, and then the person is released. It's a game that's been playing out in that country for a long time. So he's going to issue a pardon, and the official news service, the Saba news agency, does a report saying that this journalist is going to be pardoned. That day, the dictator of Yemen receives a phone call from the White House, not from some liaison, not from Secretary of State, from President Obama himself, personally. And President Obama tells the dictator of Yemen that he's deeply concerned about news that Abdullah Haider Shaya is going to be released, and the pardon is torn up. Unless you think I'm making this up or I've just heard it secondhand, I know this because the White House put it on their own website in a readout of the phone call from that day. And when I called the State Department to ask them, this is a year and a half after Abdullah Haider had been in prison since this phone call, what is the U.S. State Department's position on Abdullah Haider Shaya? They said our position remains the same as that articulated by President Obama in that phone call. We believe he should be kept in prison. So this journalist is in prison because of the President of the United States making a phone call and having his pardon ripped up. And he's not doing well in prison. I'm in touch with his family. My understanding is that he's starting to lose his mind, which is very common with people that are kept in solitary confinement or in these conditions. And none of the news organizations that worked with him in the U.S., ABC News, Washington Post, and none of them have said anything about his case. Where are they? When he's getting them sensationalist footage, when he interviewed Anwar al-Awlaki, they all wanted to broadcast his comments about Nidal Hassan, who conducted the massacre at Fort Hood, Texas. And they wanted to know what al-Awlaki said about the underwear bomber. You know why we know what al-Awlaki thought about that? Because Abdullah Haider Shaya found him, interviewed him, and published it in the Washington Post on NBC. And yet, when he's in prison, they say nothing. It's shameful. It's shameful. And that's often what happens in these cases. Journalists... Journalists like myself and others, we go into these countries, and I encourage people to read the acknowledgments in my book, because I tell you, I name the names of all of the journalists in Yemen and Somalia and Afghanistan and elsewhere around the world who made it possible for this story to be told. And they're the real heroes of this. Unfamous journalists who report oftentimes not in English, take the great risks. People like me, I go in and I can go somewhere for a few weeks or a month, and I depend on them to be able to tell these stories. So when something happens to one of our colleagues, Somalia journalists are being gunned down in record numbers. In Yemen, journalists are being thrown in prison. If we don't speak up when we have a platform and defend our colleagues, we should be ashamed of ourselves. And we should be ashamed to call ourselves journalists.
Noam, as we wrap up, this is the week that the Bush Library is being opened in Dallas. where there is an evaluation, a reevaluation going on of his record. It's the 10th anniversary of the war in Iraq. And today we're talking about the years of the Obama administration. Can you talk about President Obama's record?
Well, let me tell you what I felt, and maybe some of the rest of you felt, when I saw the pictures of the Bush Library presentation. There was a group of men standing there, former presidents, the ones who are alive. Every one of them is a major criminal, a major criminal. Obama is continuing the grand tradition. Shouldn't be a great surprise. And I guess the sentence that came to my mind at the time is actually from Thomas Jefferson, who said once that, he said, "I tremble for my country when I think that God is just and someday will bring us to his judgment." Well, if we can't bring them to some kind of judgment either, if not in the courts, at least in public opinion, then it's kind of like what Jeremy said. We're not doing our duty just as responsible people.
Jeremy, we're going to end with you. This is your second major book. Your first book was Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army, where you really reframed the whole discussion about mercenaries and the privatization of the U.S. military. Suffice it to say, here we are, 6 years later, and Eric Prince had to move, the founder of Blackwater, to Abu Dhabi, and you remain here in the United States. And I wanted to ask, with this second book, and Jeremy's going to be signing afterwards, and I encourage everyone to get this book, not just for interesting summer reading, but that we can see a spring and a summer of U.S. foreign policy. When we are informed, what a difference it makes to begin with those tools, to be empowered to challenge how we are represented in the rest of the world. But I want to ask you, Jeremy, finally, your new book is called Dirty Wars, The World is a Battlefield. What are you hoping to accomplish with this book, and why you even call it Dirty Wars?
One thing that I think you'll notice if you read the book, I've talked to friends about when I wrote Blackwater. I think I've grown up a lot since I wrote that book, in a sense, because something really strange happened to me after I wrote Blackwater, and that was that I started to get emails and other electronic communications from people that had served in special operations forces or worked with the CIA. Not senior officials. I don't hobnob with the powerful ever. In fact, when I was talking about this official who told me what he said about the killing of Abdul Rahman, I had to chase him around the campus of a university I found him on, and he did not want to speak to me. I had to sort of chase him. That's pretty much the only interaction I have with powerful officials, is chasing them somewhere. But I started to get communications from operators and people that were doing these operations, and there was a sort of a pattern to them early on, and sometimes they would come to events and come up to me afterwards, and they'd say, a lot of them would say, I don't care very much for your politics, but you were totally right about Blackwater. Can't stand them. And I got to know people in that world, in that community, because they also had problems with Blackwater and didn't like various actions or problems that the company's actions had caused for their units, or the fact that they were getting paid so much more than the conventional soldiers, whatever it was. But I started a dialogue with some of these people that continues to this day, and I've learned a tremendous amount from them about how these operations run. And what I tried to do in the book, I mean, I hope I succeeded to a degree with it, is to weave in and out of stories that show the complicated landscape of the killing fields and the men who do the operations on the ground, the figures who are identified as the targets, the civilians that are forced to live on the other side of the barrel of the gun or in the place where the bombs are going off, and to put it in a historical context. I think if you had asked me years ago what I think, what I wanted to accomplish or what I think should be done, I would have pretended to have an answer, because I think I was bullheaded. I think that we, unfortunately, are only at the very beginning of a conversation that we have to, that's urgent and that we have to have in this country about how far we as a society have let things go since 9/11 in the name of protecting our security. And I concur very much with what Noam said about being gripped by fear. Fear is a very powerful force, and if you don't figure out a way to confront it and not be owned by it, then things like the Patriot Act happen, and civil liberties get rolled back. And people say, oh, NDAA, the people that are whining about that are crazy, and it's conspiracy theory and all of these things. And you just study history. It starts somewhere. It starts with an idea, and then a crisis happens, and they implement the idea that's been laying around. It's a very age-old concept. And my hope is that people use the book as actionable intelligence, which is actually a term in the CIA or in the targeting business. But I want it to be actionable intelligence to work toward a democratic process of confronting our own fear and also holding those in power accountable, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. I think all of us should be defined not by the public pronouncements of politicians, but by what we do in response to the actions they're doing in our name. And that's the spirit I wrote this book in.